Hey everyone, today we're stepping back into a 1960s American kitchen, where a formica table waited beneath a hanging light steam fogged the window above the sink, and a glass casserole dish sat beside a bowl of canned green beans. Somewhere down the hallway a television was still talking. Outside, a bicycle had been dropped on the lawn. Then came the call that could reach the basement, the backyard, and sometimes half the neighborhood dinner. For many children, that word was not an invitation to finish one more page, take one more turn, or arrive whenever hunger became convenient. It meant come now. The meatloaf was already sliced. The potatoes were losing steam, and the person who had spent the afternoon planning the meal was not operating a restaurant with flexible seating. Among the strict dinner rules many 1960s children remember, the first began before anyone touched a fork, when the kitchen called dinner had already begun. If stories about forgotten American foods, grocery habits, kitchen rules and family traditions bring back memories for you, please like the video and subscribe to Forgotten American Home. Which dinner rule from your childhood do you remember most clearly? And what words did someone in your family use when it was time to come to the table? The rules in this series were not followed in every home, and families differed by region, religion, income, culture, and work schedule. But each rule earned its place because it shaped the physical experience of dinner, who arrived, who waited, what was served, what children were expected to do, and what happened when they tested the limits. The first rule was simple enough to understand, and surprisingly difficult to obey. When dinner was called, children were expected to stop what they were doing and come to the table promptly. That command carried the weight of everything already happening in the kitchen. Before convenience foods became even more dominant later in the century, dinner, in many households, still required a sequence of small jobs that had to meet at roughly the same moment. Meat browned in an electric skillet, potatoes boiled in a dented saucepan, a can opener turned through the lid of peas or corn, rolls warmed in the oven beside a casserole covered with foil. Someone checked the clock, stirred the gravy, filled the water glasses and called a child to place forks beside the plates. Even a meal built from packaged ingredients demanded timing. A frozen vegetable could become limp. Gravy developed a skin. Toasted bread cooled with remarkable determination. Once the food reached the table, delaying the meal meant that everyone else waited or ate while one place remained empty. From the kitchen, the rule looked less like strict discipline and more like a reasonable request from the person trying to land several hot dishes at once, without the potatoes turning into wallpaper paste. From the child's side of the house, however, dinner often arrived at exactly the wrong moment. A neighborhood baseball game might be tied. A model airplane needed one final piece. Homework had reached the question that made no sense until a parent called from another room. A favorite television program was approaching the scene everyone at school would discuss the next morning. Children playing outdoors might hear their names called through a screen door, sometimes repeated with a middle name that suggested negotiations had officially ended. The required response was not silence, and certainly not the hopeful belief that a younger sibling would report your absence inaccurately. A child was expected to answer, wash up if necessary, and appear. In some neighborhoods, several mothers called from different porches within the same 15-minute stretch, and the sidewalks emptied as though an invisible factory whistle had sounded. Each house had its own schedule, but the message was recognizable: family time had begun, and the child's private activities were temporarily over. Prompt arrival also reflected the sharper boundary many families place between adult authority and childhood preference. A child might be asked what happened at school, whether a test went well, or who won the ball game, but the decision about when dinner occurred usually belonged to the adults managing work, cooking younger children and evening responsibilities. Parents returning from offices, factories, shops, farms, or shift work could not always create a perfect family schedule, and plenty of households ate at unusual hours. Yet where a set dinner time existed, it helped organize the evening. Dishes had to be washed, baths might follow, homework still waited, clothes or lunches had to be prepared for the next morning. The meal was one moving part in a larger household machine, and a late child could slow the entire arrangement. This did not mean every family sat together peacefully each night. Some ate in stages, some worked conflicting shifts, and some children had already eaten before an adult arrived home. But in households that gathered around one table, punctuality was often treated as respect for everyone else's time. The consequences for ignoring the call range from a sharp reminder to a cooling plate left at the child's place. Some parents sent an older sibling to retrieve the missing diner. Others called again louder, using a tone that made the distance from backyard to kitchen feel suddenly much longer. A child who arrived late might receive a lecture about gratitude, responsibility, or the amount of work required to prepare food. In stricter homes, delay could mean losing television privileges, being assigned an extra chore, or discovering that the best piece of chicken had already been claimed. The punishment did not need to be dramatic. Often the embarrassment of walking into a silent room while everyone else sat ready was enough. The chair scraped. A napkin unfolded. Someone looked at the clock. The child understood that the meal had been waiting, and no amount of creative explanation about an unfinished bicycle race was likely to improve the atmosphere. Still, the dinner call could become one of the most comforting sounds of childhood. It meant the porch light was coming on. The kitchen was warm, and there was a place already set. Even children who complained about leaving their games often remember the route back clearly through the screen door past the refrigerator, hum toward the smell of onions, roast chicken, tomato sauce, or something bubbling beneath a layer of melted cheese. The rule demanded obedience, but it also created a daily moment of return. Whatever had happened at school or in the neighborhood, the family gathered again around the same table, and arriving was only the beginning. Before a child could sit beneath that bright kitchen light, there was usually another inspection waiting at the sink, where dusty hands, grass-stained knees, and hair flattened by an afternoon outdoors had to be made presentable enough for dinner. The sink often stood between the back door and the dinner table, which made it less a convenience than a checkpoint. A child coming in from the yard carried the afternoon along with him: dust on the palms, grass marks on the knees, pencil smudges across one finger, perhaps a faint streak of bicycle grease that had appeared without explanation. Before anyone touched a dinner roll or reached for the water glass, those hands were expected to meet a bar of soap. In many 1960s homes, the soap dish held a softened rectangle worn thin at the center, and the hand towel nearby was already damp from several earlier inspections. The command might be wash up, go clean your hands, or simply a look toward the sink that required no translation. This second dinner rule was not only about germs, it was about crossing from the disorder of childhood into the order of the family meal. Outside clothes, playground dirt, and unfinished adventures were supposed to stop at the kitchen doorway. At the table, a child was expected to appear ready. That preparation could involve considerably more than a quick splash of water. Fingernails might be checked, especially after digging in a garden, building something in the garage, or playing in a vacant lot. Faces were wiped with a washcloth if chocolate dust or the remains of an after-school snack had survived unnoticed. Hair was pressed down with a wet comb, and shirts were straightened before the child took a seat. In some families, school clothes had already been changed for play, and dinner required only reasonably clean hands and a face that did not alarm the serving bowl. In more formal households, particularly when guests were present or Sunday dinner was being served, children could be expected to look nearly as tidy as they had that morning. The standards varied widely, but the principle was familiar. The table was not simply another piece of furniture. It was a shared space, and arriving dirty suggested that the child had not taken the meal or the people serving it seriously enough. The physical evidence of the rule sat in plain sight. A bathroom sink held a porcelain cup and a toothbrush standing upright. A kitchen sink might have a metal drain board, a dish rack and a soap dish squeezed between the faucet and the window. Paper towels were not used in every household, so children dried their hands on a cloth towel that had to last through several visits. Some families kept a small comb in a drawer near the kitchen, or sent children back down the hallway if their hair looked as though it had negotiated privately with the wind. The ritual could be brief, but it was rarely invisible. Water ran. Soap slipped from small fingers. A child returned with wet cuffs and claimed to have washed thoroughly. An adult then examined hands that were suspiciously dry, or fingernails that still contained half the backyard. The inspection was not always scientific, but it was remarkably efficient. Children quickly learned that holding clean palms forward while hiding the fingertips was not a strategy with a long future. Cleanliness also connected dinner to broader ideas about manners and respectability. Many parents believed that children learned public behavior through repeated private routines. If a child could wash before supper, sit in clean clothes and handle food without leaving fingerprints on every serving dish, that child might also behave properly in a restaurant, at a church meal, or in another family's home. The evening table became a practice room for the larger world. Good manners were not saved for company because adults often argued habits did not appear magically when guests arrived. They had to be rehearsed on ordinary nights when dinner was meatloaf, canned corn and sliced bread. For children, this could make a simple meal feel unexpectedly official. The family had seen them muddy, sleepy, loud and unreasonable, yet they were still expected to approach the table as though someone important might be watching. Usually someone was. A parent could detect one dirty fingernail from the opposite end of the table with the accuracy of a trained inspector. There was also a practical side to the rule that becomes easy to overlook. Dinner dishes were often shared. Bread came from one plate. Butter sat in one dish. Serving spoons moved between hands. Pitchers, salt shakers and bowls passed around a table where several people touched the same objects. A child who arrived covered in soil, paint, pet hair or machine grease did not keep that evidence confined to one place. It transferred to the napkin, the drinking glass, the chair, and occasionally the white tablecloth brought out for company. Washing before eating protected the meal from the ordinary mess of the day and reduced the clean-up waiting afterward. The person who had scrubbed the counters prepared the food, and set the table had little enthusiasm for discovering a muddy handprint beside the casserole. In households where one adult carried most of the domestic work, cleanliness before dinner could be an act of cooperation, even if children experienced it mostly as an interruption between play and potatoes. Not every child arrived home from a suburban lawn, and not every family used the same standard of appearance. Rural children might come in after helping with animals or garden work. City children returned from sidewalks, schoolyards, buses and apartment stairwells. In some working families, dinner was hurried and practical, with little time for combed hair or formal inspection. In others, grandparents or extended relatives enforced traditions that had travelled from different regions and cultures. Some children wore bibs, some changed clothes, and some were simply told to keep dirty sleeves away from the food. The rule adapted to the household, but its meaning remained recognizable. Before joining the meal, a child had to show some effort to leave the day's mess behind. Once hands were clean, hair was reasonably settled, and the chair had been reached without transferring the outdoors to the table, another test began. The food might already be waiting, but the child still could not begin. First, everyone had to sit down, the serving bowls had to make their slow journey, and patience had to hold until the final plate was ready. The plate could be in front of you, the potatoes could be steaming, and the butter might already be softening beside the bread, but that did not mean dinner had officially started. In many 1960s, households, a child was expected to wait until everyone was seated and the meal was ready to begin. A fork lifted too early could bring a quiet correction from across the table, sometimes only a raised eyebrow, sometimes the familiar instruction to wait for everyone. The rule sounded simple, yet it demanded a surprising amount of control from a hungry child who'd been smelling dinner for half an hour. Meatloaf rested under a stripe of tomato glaze. Green beans shone with butter. Mashed potatoes held a small crater waiting for gravy. Every object on the plate suggested immediate action, while every adult at the table suggested patience. The meal was not considered a collection of individual plates. It was a shared event, and the first bite belonged to the family rather than the fastest hand. Before that moment arrived, several pieces had to fall into place. Chairs scraped backward. Water glasses were filled. A serving spoon disappeared into the potatoes and returned with a rounded scoop. Bread moved in a basket lined with a folded napkin, and the butter dish began its slow trip around the table. In some homes, plates were filled in the kitchen and carried out one by one. In others, bowls and platters were placed in the centre, so each person could serve or be served. The person who had cooked might still be standing at the stove checking the gravy turning off a burner, or searching for the spoon everyone believed had already been placed on the table. Children who had arrived early watched the operation from their chairs, hands in their laps or fingers circling the rim of a water glass. The waiting could feel endless, although it often lasted less than a minute. Childhood has a special way of making 60 seconds between a hot dinner roll and permission to eat feel like a minor historical period. The practical reason behind the rule was fairness. If one child began early, that child might finish the best parts before someone else had received a serving. The first diner could reach for seconds while another family member was still waiting for the peas. Beginning together also kept the meal from breaking into separate schedules. One person did not eat while another set the table, another searched for a napkin, and another remained in the kitchen doing the final work. Waiting acknowledged that dinner had required more than simply sitting down. Someone had planned the groceries prepared, the food watched the clock and carried the dishes. In households where one person, often the mother or another female relative, did most of that labour, starting before she sat down could be interpreted as especially rude. The meal was supposed to include the cook, not merely consume what she'd produced. Many families did not express the idea in those terms, but the rule made the point physically. Nobody began until the person doing the last kitchen task had a chair. Who gave the signal varied from home to home. Some families waited until the eldest adult lifted a fork. Others began after a parent said, "Go ahead." In religious households, the meal might not start until grace had been said, making silence and stillness part of the opening ritual. Some children watched the father, some watched the mother, and some simply learned to notice when everyone else had started. There was no single national arrangement, and real family life rarely matched the tidy scenes shown in magazines. Shift work, crowded kitchens, babies visiting relatives, and different cultural traditions shaped the order of every table. Yet the underlying expectation appeared in many forms: do not act as though your hunger matters more than everyone else's readiness. A child who forgot might already have a bite halfway to the mouth before noticing the room had gone quiet. The fork then had to complete an awkward retreat, carrying the potato back toward the plate as though nothing unusual had happened. Waiting also trained children for meals beyond their own kitchen. At a holiday table, church supper restaurant, or neighbour's house, beginning too soon could mark a child as careless or poorly taught. Parents often treated ordinary family dinners as rehearsal for those more public situations. A child who learned to wait on a Tuesday night was less likely to attack the roles at a wedding reception, or begin eating while a host was still serving guests. The home table became a classroom without a chalkboard. Lessons were taught through repeated motions: sit, wait, watch, pass, thank, begin. The rules were not always explained because adults assumed repetition would make them automatic. That approach could feel strict, but it also reflected the importance placed on self-command. Good manners were understood not as grand gestures, but as the ability to delay a small pleasure long enough to consider the people nearby. For a hungry 8-year-old facing fried chicken, this was advanced moral training. The rule could create small moments of tension, especially when dinner was late or portions were already cooling. A child might ask whether everyone was ready, not from concern for the group, but from urgent interest in the gravy. A younger sibling could begin without noticing, forcing the adults to decide whether to correct the child or allow the entire table to proceed. Guests complicated matters further because children had to wait while introductions serving, or polite conversation stretched the opening. On quieter nights, however, the pause gave the meal a clear beginning. The family settled. The kitchen noise softened. The radio or television might be lowered in another room. For a brief moment, everyone faced the same table and the same food. Then the first fork moved, followed by the rest, and the tension disappeared into the ordinary sounds of eating. That shared beginning is one reason the memory remains so strong. It turned dinner from a plate delivered on demand into a household ritual with a recognizable threshold. Before the signal, the meal was preparation. After it, conversation, complaints, requests, and negotiations could begin. Children learned to read faces, hands, and the movement of serving dishes. They understood that being present was not enough. They had to be ready with everyone else. Yet in many homes, even that first bite waited behind one more ceremony. Hands grew still, eyes lowered, and the room became quiet for a few seconds as a blessing placed gratitude before appetite. Before the first fork touched the plate, many 1960s children were expected to lower their heads and wait through one more quiet ritual. Hands might be folded, joined with the person beside them, or simply kept still near the edge of the table. A father, mother, grandparent, or older child began a familiar blessing, while steam rose from the serving bowls and the smell of roast chicken gravy or baked beans made concentration increasingly difficult. For children in religious households, saying grace was not treated as an optional decoration added to special occasions. It could be part of breakfast, supper, Sunday dinner, and meals eaten in a church basement beneath fluorescent lights. The words differed from family to family, but the rule remained clear. Appetite waited until gratitude had been expressed. A child might not understand every phrase, yet understood perfectly that opening one eye to inspect the biscuits was considered evidence that the spiritual portion of dinner had not entirely succeeded. Some families used a short blessing repeated so often that even the youngest children knew its rhythm. Others offered a longer prayer that mentioned absent relatives, a neighbour who was ill, a difficult work day, a safe journey, or the hands that had prepared the food. In some homes, each person took a turn leading grace, which could make a shy child stare at the tablecloth while trying to remember the correct opening words. A memorized prayer provided safety. An improvised one created risk. Children sometimes spoke too softly, forgot where they were going, or thanked God for the mashed potatoes while overlooking the rest of creation. Adults might gently guide them to the end, although younger siblings were rarely as discreet. The blessing made dinner feel connected to something larger than the kitchen. The canned corn, sliced bread, and pot roast were ordinary foods, but the act of pausing suggested they should not be treated as automatic. The practice varied enormously across American households. Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Orthodox, and other religious families carried different traditions to the table, and even families within the same denomination did not pray in identical ways. Some bowed their heads without holding hands. Some recited a blessing in a language preserved by grandparents or immigrant relatives. Some prayed only on Sundays and holidays, while others did so at nearly every meal. Many families observed no formal prayer at all, whether because they were non-religious, less observant, or simply followed a different household routine. The image of every 1960s family saying the same grace around the same suburban table belongs more to advertising and television than to lived reality. Yet for children who grew up with the ritual, the memory could be extremely precise. The rough texture of a relative's hand, the edge of a cloth napkin beneath the fingers, the refrigerator motor starting in the silence, and the temptation to look up before the final word. For adults, grace often reinforced several dinner lessons at once. It taught children to pause to recognize that food required labor and to remember that not every family had the same abundance. A meal represented grocery money, cooking time, farming transportation, and the work of the person who had stood over the stove. Religious language gave those practical facts a moral frame. Gratitude was not supposed to depend on whether the vegetable was a favorite or the meat had been cooked exactly as the child preferred. Even a plate containing liver-creamed peas or a casserole whose ingredients had become suspiciously cooperative was still presented as something to receive respectfully. That expectation could be comforting, but it could also add pressure. Complaining immediately after a prayer of thanks was poor timing in every possible sense. A child who announced dislike too quickly risked turning one family rule into a demonstration of several violations at once. The pause before eating also established order at crowded tables. Younger children stopped fidgeting. Serving dishes rested. Adults ended side conversations. For a few seconds, everyone participated in the same action, even if one child was thinking mostly about the pie cooling on the counter. In large families, that shared stillness could be one of the only moments when nobody was reaching passing, correcting or asking for something. The prayer marked a clear threshold between preparation and eating. Before it, chairs were still moving and bowls were being arranged. After it, the meal belonged to everyone. Children learned that the final word mattered. Beginning too early was not only impolite, but could be treated as disrespectful to the family's faith. The most experienced children waited for the amen, then allowed a small additional pause just long enough to be certain an adult was not about to add one more sentence. Of course, children found ways to make even solemn moments human. Someone squeezed another person's hand during grace, a sibling whispered. A toddler shouted the final word too soon. One child opened both eyes and discovered a parent already watching. At holiday dinners, the blessing could lengthen while bowls of potatoes cooled, and several grandchildren silently reconsidered the value of patience. Yet those imperfect moments often became the memories families preserved. Years later, a person might forget what was served on a particular Sunday, but still remember a grandfather's voice beginning the same prayer, a mother reaching across the table to gather small hands, or the sudden calm that settled over a noisy room. The rule was strict because it asked children to place gratitude before hunger. Once the blessing ended, however, another kind of discipline began. Heads lifted, napkins moved, and every child was expected to sit straight, keep restless feet under control, and remove both elbows from the table before anyone had to ask twice. The chair itself could become an instrument of correction. A child slid too low, leaned too far, wrapped one foot around a chair leg, or let both elbows settle comfortably beside the plate, and somewhere across the table an adult noticed. In many 1960s homes, proper posture was treated as part of proper eating. Sit up straight and elbows off the table belong to the same family of commands as don't reach and chew before you speak. The dining chair might have a vinyl seat that squeaked whenever a restless body shifted. Beneath the table, shoes tapped a metal leg, knees bumped a sibling, and feet searched for anything except the floor. Above it, children were expected to present an entirely different picture. Back upright, shoulders, steady hands, controlled and elbows safely removed from the territory near the mashed potatoes. Dinner was not merely a time to consume food. It was a nightly examination in how much movement a young body could contain while still appearing civilized. The rule had practical origins. Family tables were often crowded with serving bowls, bread plates, glasses, salt and pepper shakers, and dishes that had to pass from one person to the next. An elbow planted beside a plate narrowed the space for everyone else. A sudden stretch could knock a milk glass, tilt a gravy boat, or push a serving dish toward the edge. Tablecloths, when used, introduced further danger. One careless arm could pull at the fabric and make every object on the table move together in a direction no cook had intended. Even on a bare formica surface, children competed for room. Large families might squeeze several chairs along one side, leaving each diner a narrow section of table, and very little freedom for architectural expansion. Keeping elbows down was a way of preserving peace, and preventing the evening meal from becoming a demonstration of gravity. Adults could describe it as manners, but anyone who had cleaned spilled milk from beneath a refrigerator understood the engineering behind the rule. Posture also carried social meaning. Parents often believed that the habits practiced at home would follow a child into restaurants, school events, church suppers, holiday meals, and visits with relatives. A child who slumped over a plate at home might do the same in front of guests. A child who rested a chin in one hand while pushing peas with the other could appear bored, ungrateful, or poorly taught. Sitting straight signaled attention. It suggested that the child recognized dinner as a shared occasion, rather than a private feeding break between more important activities. In some homes, especially those influenced by etiquette books or formal family traditions, posture was connected to respectability. Children were told that people noticed how they sat, how they held utensils, and whether they seemed comfortable without becoming careless. The lesson was not always about wealth or formality. Families with modest meals could be strict about table behavior precisely because manners cost nothing and traveled anywhere. A plate might hold beans, cornbread, and leftover meat, but the child eating it was still expected to look as though the meal deserved attention. For the child, the difficulty usually happened below the table where adult supervision was less complete, but sibling awareness was excellent. Feet swung because they did not reach the floor. Shoes nudged chair legs. One knee drifted into another person's territory. Brothers and sisters kicked each other accidentally at first, and then with increasing purpose while their faces remained unusually innocent above the tablecloth. A parent might stop mid-sentence and ask what was happening underneath. The correct answer was always, nothing, a claim rarely supported by the movement of the furniture. Some children hooked their ankles around the chair rungs. Others rocked backward, balancing on two legs, until an adult warned them that the chair was not designed for performance. The rule feet still beneath the table protected more than appearances. It kept chairs upright, shins unbruised, and family arguments from beginning with a silent kick delivered during the vegetables. Enforcement could be nearly invisible. A parent tapped the table near a child's elbow. A grandparent straightened his own back as an example. Someone said the child's name in a tone that identified the problem without describing it. In stricter households, the same correction returned several times during one meal because posture has a way of collapsing whenever attention moves elsewhere. Children sat straight for 30 seconds, then gradually folded toward the plate as though pulled by the food. An elbow crept back, a chin lowered. One shoulder leaned against the chair. The adult corrected it again. The ritual could become so familiar that both sides performed it automatically. Some children were threatened with losing dessert or leaving the table, though often the consequence was simply continued supervision. The rule worked through repetition. By the time guests arrived for Sunday dinner, a child might sit perfectly for 20 minutes, proof that ordinary weekday correction had produced at least temporary results. Not every household demanded the same posture, and formality could change with the occasion. A quick supper in the kitchen might allow more relaxation than Thanksgiving dinner in the dining room. Young children were given more patience than older ones. Families eating from trays near the television followed different physical rules from those gathered around a crowded table. Rural, urban, working-class, middle-class, immigrant and multi-generational households brought their own expectations, and some adults cared far more about conversation and gratitude than about the exact position of an elbow. Yet many children remember the correction because it represented something larger than posture. Adults were teaching control over small impulses. Do not sprawl, do not crowd, do not kick, and do not behave as though you are alone. The lesson could feel fussy when a child was tired or hungry, but it helped turn several moving bodies into a meal that could proceed without disaster. Once the elbows were lowered and the chair stopped rocking, the upper half of the child appeared ready for dinner. But clean hands and proper posture still did not guarantee clean clothing. Gravy-dripped butter softened, and fingers had a remarkable ability to locate the front of a shirt. That was why another object waited beside the plate, folded neatly or tucked beneath the fork. The napkin had its own rule, its own proper location, and absolutely no intention of allowing a sleeve to do its job. The napkin waited beside the plate like a small test that began before the food arrived. In some 1960s homes it was a square of cloth folded beneath the fork. In others it was a paper napkin taken from a metal holder printed with flowers checks, or a colour chosen to match the kitchen. Whatever its material, the instruction was usually the same: place it in your lap. Not under the plate, not twisted in your hands, and certainly not left untouched while your sleeve handled the gravy. A child who sat down and immediately tucked the napkin into a shirt collar might be corrected for looking too much like a customer at a seafood restaurant. A child who ignored it entirely could expect another reminder before the first spill. The sixth dinner rule was simple in theory. The napkin belonged in the lap, ready to be lifted when needed, while shirts, dresses, and forearms remained outside the official cleanup system. The rule protected clothing during meals that were rarely as tidy as the pictures in cookbooks suggested. Tomato sauce slipped from spaghetti, butter ran down warm corn, gravy travelled farther than expected. Canned peaches released syrup at the exact moment a child tried to cut one with the side of a fork. Even milk could escape a glass without warning, especially when an elbow-serving bowl or younger sibling entered the same small space. Children's clothes represented money washing ironing, and time and many garments were expected to last through repeated wear or be passed to a younger brother or sister. A stain was not merely a stain. It could become an evening project involving cold water, laundry soap, a scrub brush, and the uncertain hope that the mark would disappear before school. The napkin offered a first line of defense. It could catch crumbs, absorb a drip, or rescue a bite of food before it reached a freshly washed skirt. Adults called this manners. The person responsible for laundry may have considered it preventive maintenance. Using the napkin correctly required more restraint than children naturally brought to the table. It was meant to blot the mouth gently, not scrub the face as though removing paint from a wall. It was not a handkerchief, a toy, a flag, a rope, or a place to hide vegetables that had failed to inspire affection. Paper napkins presented their own temptations. A corner could be folded into a tiny boat shredded beneath the table rolled into a ball, or dampened until it became a substance no manufacturer had intended. Cloth napkins lasted longer, and therefore had more opportunities to become involved in sibling mischief. Children twisted them, snapped them tied knots, or allowed one end to slide dangerously close to a plate. The correction might be quiet: "Leave your napkin alone." That sentence usually meant the napkin had already received far more attention than the food. Proper use required the object to remain almost invisible until needed, which was a difficult assignment for anything placed directly in front of a bored child. The sleeve was the napkin's greatest rival. It was always available, required no searching, and moved automatically toward the mouth before good judgment had time to intervene. A child wiping tomato sauce across a cuff might not realize what had happened until an adult saw the evidence. Then came the instruction to use the napkin, often followed by a second instruction, not to rub the stain deeper into the fabric. Hands created similar trouble. Greasy fingers reached for a shirt front, the side of a chair, or the underside of the table. In households where bread, fried chicken, corn on the cob, or other finger foods appeared regularly, children had to learn when touching food was acceptable and what to do afterward. The napkin allowed the meal to remain informal without becoming chaotic. It gave each person a private tool for managing the small evidence of eating. This mattered especially when serving dishes, glasses, and utensils were being passed around. A hand coated in butter could turn the salt shaker into a family record of everything already eaten. Napkin expectations also changed with the occasion. A quick weekday supper might involve folded paper napkins pulled from a package in the pantry. Sunday dinner, a holiday gathering, or a meal with guests could bring cloth napkins, a tablecloth, and a more careful arrangement of silverware. Children who knew how to unfold a napkin and place it quietly in their laps were considered prepared for meals outside the home. At a restaurant, church, banquet, wedding reception, or relatives' formal dining room, the adults did not want to begin a public lesson in basic table behavior. Weeknight practice was supposed to prevent that embarrassment, yet households differed widely. Some used paper napkins every day, some saved them for company, and some relied on dish towels or whatever practical substitute was available. The point was not luxury. A plain paper square could carry the same lesson as embroidered cloth. Think ahead. Protect your clothes. Clean your mouth discreetly and do not leave the work of your meal on every surface you touch. At the end of dinner, the napkin still had rules to follow. It was not crumpled into the plate with leftover food unless the household allowed it. A cloth napkin might be placed beside the plate, folded loosely or gathered for washing. Paper napkins could be used for one final wipe before being carried away with the scraps. Children helping to clear the table learned quickly that a wet napkin concealed beneath a plate could surprise the person lifting it. A napkin soaked with milk or gravy also had a remarkable ability to transfer its contents to a clean hand. The evening lesson therefore extended beyond appearance. Proper handling made clearing easier, protected dishes, and respected the person who would deal with everything after the family left the table. The napkin began as a small square beside the fork, but it touched nearly every part of the meal, clothing, cleanliness, manners, laundry, and clean-up. Once the napkin was safely in place, a child's hands were free to confront the next challenge. Forks, spoons, and knives waited beside the plate, each with an approved purpose and several forbidden ones. They could cut meat, lift peas, and spread butter. They could not drum on the table point at a sibling launch food or become props in a story that should have waited until after dinner. The napkin taught children where to put the mess. The silverware would teach them what their hands were allowed to do. The fork looked harmless beside the plate, but in a child's hand it offered far more possibilities than any etiquette book intended. Its proper purpose was to lift peas, hold a slice of meat steady, or gather the final pieces of casserole without scraping the dish into surrender. Its improper purposes were nearly endless. A fork could tap a rhythm against a drinking glass draw lines through mashed potatoes, point dramatically at a sibling, or become a tiny rake for rearranging food into suspicious piles. Knives invited even greater ambition. They could serve as swords, drumsticks, levers, or tools for cutting a dinner roll into pieces so small that eating it became a distant concern. In many 1960s, Holmes adults stopped these experiments with one direct reminder. Forks, knives, and spoons were tools, not toys. The seventh dinner rule demanded that children use each utensil for its intended job, keep it near the plate, and resist turning supper into a performance involving metal objects and nervous relatives. This rule protected both manners and safety. Family tables could be crowded, especially when several children sat close together, and serving bowls occupied the remaining space. A fork waved during an exciting story might pass near another person's face. A knife held upright could frighten an adult even when the child insisted it was part of a completely harmless adventure. Spoons loaded too heavily could send peas, gravy, or pudding toward locations not included in the meal plan. Parents therefore taught children to keep utensils low, move them carefully, and put them down when speaking with animated hands. Younger children might use smaller forks or blunt knives until they could manage ordinary tableware without dropping it, scraping it, or holding it in a clenched fist. The lesson was practical metal utensils were designed to control food, and children were expected to control the utensils. Whenever that chain of command reversed, dinner became noticeably less peaceful. Using silverware correctly could involve a series of smaller instructions. The fork was not held like a shovel unless the meal truly required emergency excavation. The knife cut food into manageable bites rather than reducing the entire plate to fragments before eating began. A spoon moved toward the mouth without turning upside down, spilling soup across the front of a shirt, or carrying more than the child could reasonably swallow. Children were told not to lick knives, chew on fork handles, or leave a spoon standing upright in mashed potatoes. They were also expected to avoid scraping the plate loudly in search of the last streak of gravy. The sound of metal dragged across china or heavy restaurant-style dishes could bring an immediate wince from everyone nearby. Even families that cared little about formal utensil placement often objected to noise. A meal already included conversation chairs serving bowls and younger children. It did not need percussion. Some children learned the rules by watching adults rather than receiving a formal lesson. They noticed how a parent held a knife, how a grandparent rested a fork between bites, or how serving utensils remained with their bowls instead of travelling onto individual plates. Others received direct correction one meal at a time. Use your fork, cut one piece first, put the knife down while you're talking. Stop tapping that spoon. The instructions arrived so regularly that children could predict them before the adult spoke. A child might begin drumming, see a parent look up and quietly lower the spoon without interrupting the conversation. That small retreat showed the real purpose of repeated correction. Adults wanted the movement to become automatic, especially before the family ate in public. A child who used utensils properly at home was less likely to attract attention at a restaurant, wedding, church supper, or relative's dining room. Weeknight meatloaf served as practice for places where the rules felt more serious. The kind of food on the plate also shaped the lesson. Fried chicken sandwiches, corn on the cob, and certain breads could be eaten by hand in many households, but children still had to know when fingers were acceptable. Picking up a pork chop, a slippery canned peach, or a handful of peas, because the fork seemed inconvenient, was usually another matter. Different families drew the line in different places, and regional customs affected what counted as proper. Some adults allowed children to eat chicken with their fingers at home but expected utensils when company visited. Others considered certain foods impossible to manage politely without hands and simply provided extra napkins. The important rule was consistency with the household's expectations. A child could not declare every difficult food a finger food merely because the fork required patience. Convenience belonged to the cook who had prepared dinner, not automatically to the diner trying to avoid peas. Utensils could also reveal sibling conflict before anyone said a word. One child tapped another's fork. A spoon disappeared from its place and reappeared near a brother's plate. Someone used the handle of a knife to move a salt shaker just beyond a younger child's reach. These acts were small enough to seem accidental and deliberate enough to begin an argument. Adults often responded before the dispute grew louder, ordering hands back to each person's own place setting. The table taught boundaries through objects. Your fork stayed near your plate. Your knife did not enter someone else's space. The serving spoon belonged to everyone and therefore could not be held hostage while one child decided whether to take more potatoes. Proper utensil use was not only about appearance, it was a system for keeping several hungry people from interfering with one another while dishes moved through a limited area. The rule also recognized the work waiting after dinner. Utensils scraped against serving dishes damaged table surfaces and sometimes disappeared beneath napkins or leftover food. A child who dropped a fork and immediately reached under the table could bump a head, upset a chair, or return holding something that no longer seemed ready for use. In many homes, the proper response was to ask for another utensil, or wait until an adult could retrieve it safely. At the end of the meal, forks, knives, and spoons had to be collected, washed, dried, and returned to a drawer divided into narrow compartments. Silverware that had been played with created more spills, more noise, and occasionally more washing. The person standing at the sink later had a strong interest in keeping every piece on the table and out of the mashed potatoes. Once children learned to keep their utensils under control, the meal could move with fewer interruptions. Forks lifted food instead of pointing. Knives stayed close to the plate. Spoons carried soup without becoming musical instruments. Yet the serving dishes remained beyond each child's immediate reach, and that created the next temptation. The bowl of peas might sit only a few inches away, but stretching across the table risked sleeves, glasses, gravy, and several earlier lessons at once. The correct solution required patience, a polite sentence, and another person's help. The bowl of peas could sit only a few inches beyond a child's plate and still be considered completely unreachable. Across the crowded dinner table it waited beside the mashed potatoes, the gravy boat, and a plate of sliced bread close enough to tempt a quick stretch of the arm. Yet in many 1960s households, reaching across another person's place was one of the fastest ways to receive a correction. A sleeve might brush a water glass. An elbow could pass over someone's food. A hand searching for the butter might knock the salt shaker into the gravy. The proper solution was not greater determination. It was a polite request. Please pass the peas. The 8th dinner rule required children to let food travel through the family rather than lunging after it themselves. The table might be small, the distance might seem ridiculous, and the person beside the bowl might be eating very slowly, but none of that changed the rule. You asked, you waited, and eventually the peas came to you. The rule made practical sense on tables crowded with more objects than open space. Serving bowls were often placed in the center, where everyone could reach at least one dish, but almost nobody could reach them all. A family meal might include a platter of meat, 2 vegetables, potatoes, bread, butter, glasses, condiments, and perhaps a pitcher of milk or iced tea. Add several plates restless children, and one tablecloth with a dangerous amount of loose fabric and a simple reach became a household risk. A child leaning across the table could drag a cuff through gravy breathe over another person's plate, or tip a glass with the underside of an arm. If the child stood halfway out of the chair to improve the angle, the danger increased. Adults who had spent time cooking and setting the table had little interest in watching dinner reorganized by one urgent request for a roll. Asking someone to pass the dish kept bodies in their own spaces and allowed the meal to proceed without requiring a towel, a lecture, and a replacement glass of milk. The request itself had rules. "Give me the potatoes" was often considered too blunt. A pointing finger accompanied by "I want that" was worse. Children were expected to name the item, say please, and direct the request towards someone who could actually help. "Please pass the bread" showed that the child understood both the object and the person carrying it. Once the dish arrived, the child took a portion without holding it for an extended inspection. The serving spoon stayed with the bowl. The bowl then continued in the expected direction, or was passed to the next person who needed it. Keeping a dish beside your own plate while deciding whether you might want seconds later was rarely appreciated. Serving food was a shared system, and one child could interrupt it simply by forgetting that the green beans belonged to everyone. The rule taught that access to the table's food came with a small obligation. Take what you need, then let the dish continue its journey. Passing dishes required cooperation from the rest of the family as well. The person nearest the peas had to notice the request finish chewing if necessary, and lift the bowl without spilling it. A younger child might pass it with both hands while an adult watched the angle carefully. Heavy platters were sometimes moved by adults, especially when they held hot meat-baked casseroles, or serving utensils likely to slide. Bowls could travel from person to person rather than being handed across a wide gap. On a crowded table, this created a slow circulation of food, with bread moving one direction and potatoes returning from another. Children learned to pay attention because several dishes might arrive at once. Accepting the butter while holding the gravy boat required more coordination than most family photographs suggested. A diner who ignored the traffic could leave another person waiting with both hands occupied, and a polite expression becoming less convincing by the second. The greatest test came when a child had already asked once, and the request seemed to disappear into adult conversation. The peas remained in place. The potatoes moved in the wrong direction. Someone passed the salt instead of the bread. Repeating the request too quickly could sound impatient, but waiting felt impossible when everyone else was eating. Children developed different strategies. Some asked again more loudly. Some tried to catch a parent's eye. Others began the forbidden reach, hoping speed would succeed where manners had failed. That was usually when an adult stopped them with the familiar words, "Ask for it to be passed." The instruction could feel ceremonial for an object sitting within sight, yet the delay was part of the lesson. A child's hunger did not grant permission to ignore the people between the plate and the serving bowl. Patience was required even when the final dinner roll appeared to be in immediate danger. Not every household served meals family style. In some homes, plates were filled in the kitchen before anyone sat down. In others, the cook placed meat and vegetables directly on each plate, leaving only bread, drinks, or condiments to be passed. Large families, small kitchens, cultural traditions, and the formality of the occasion all shaped the arrangement. Sunday dinner might involve serving bowls and platters that never appeared on an ordinary school night. A quick meal of sandwiches or soup created fewer opportunities for reaching than a holiday table crowded with side dishes. Yet even when little food moved around the table, the rule applied to salt, pepper, butter napkins and anything else located beyond one person's place. Reaching across someone was treated as an intrusion. Asking acknowledged that another person occupied the space and could help. It turned a basic appetite into a small social exchange. There was also a lesson in restraint hidden inside the passing. A child had to wait until the bowl arrived, then take a reasonable portion without searching for the largest piece or removing the best-looking roll from beneath several others. Fingers did not belong in a shared dish when a serving utensil was available. The spoon was not licked before being returned. A child who wanted more waited until everyone had received a first serving, a rule that would become even more important later in the meal. The passing system therefore connected manners with fairness. Food moved through the table in an orderly way so that several people could share from the same limited supply. The bowl itself became a reminder that dinner was not assembled for one individual. It belonged to the group. By the time the peas finally reached the child's plate, the request had required attention, patience, clear speech, and cooperation from at least one other person. That was a great deal of social training hidden inside one spoonful of vegetables. The child said thank you, the bowl moved onward, and the meal continued without a sleeve in the gravy. Yet those two polite words were not reserved only for successful rescue operations involving potatoes. Please and thank you were expected whenever a child requested food received help or acknowledged the work at the table. They were short words, but in many households forgetting them could stop a serving dish in mid-air. The serving bowl could stop halfway across the table because one small word had been left behind. A child asked for bread, potatoes, milk, or another helping, and the adult holding the dish waited just long enough for the silence to become noticeable. Sometimes the reminder came directly, "What do you say?" Sometimes a parent repeated the request in its corrected form, placing special weight on the missing word. In many 1960s, households' please and thank you were not reserved for guests, restaurants, or holiday dinners. They belonged to ordinary meals beside the salt shaker and the folded napkin. A child who wanted the butter was expected to ask politely. A child who received it was expected to show appreciation even if the person passing it was a sibling who had done so with visible reluctance. The 9th dinner rule made courtesy part of the mechanics of eating. Food moved around the table through requests, favours, and acknowledgements, and every short exchange offered another chance to prove that hunger had not erased good manners. The rule often began with complete sentences. Milk was not considered a request. Neither was pointing at the pitcher, tapping the bread plate, or staring meaningfully at the person nearest the potatoes. Children were taught to say, "May I have some milk, please," or "Please pass the rolls." The exact phrasing varied, and not every family demanded formal language, but the expectation was that another person should not be treated like part of the furniture. Someone had to hear the request, interrupt a bite, lift the bowl, and move it safely across the table. Saying please recognized that effort before it happened. Saying thank you recognized it afterward. The exchange might last only a few seconds, yet adults believed those seconds mattered. A child who practiced courtesy at home would be more likely to use it at school, in a neighbour's kitchen, at a church supper, or in a restaurant where the family's behaviour could be observed by people who did not already know its better qualities. Thank you also reached beyond the person passing a dish. In some homes, children were expected to thank the person who had cooked, especially after a special meal or when visiting relatives. The words might be spoken directly at the table or offered later while dishes were being cleared. This acknowledgement carried more weight than children always understood. Dinner represented several forms of labour that disappeared once the plates arrived. Someone had checked the pantry, written a grocery list, compared prices, carried paper bags into the kitchen, opened cans, peeled vegetables, watched the oven, and tried to bring every part of the meal together while it was still warm. Saying thank you did not wash the casserole dish or remove grease from the stove, but it recognized that food had not simply appeared beneath the hanging light. In households where one person performed most of this work day after day, a child's gratitude could be brief and still meaningful. Silence, especially after complaining or asking for seconds, could feel like another burden placed on the cook. The rule became more complicated among siblings, where gratitude sometimes had to overcome years of accumulated suspicion. A brother passed the gravy but held it just beyond reach. A sister handed over the bread basket after selecting the best roll for herself. A younger child delivered the salt shaker with both hands and the seriousness of a diplomatic exchange. Adults still expected the receiving child to say thank you. Courtesy was not cancelled because the helper had been annoying 5 minutes earlier. This made the table a training ground for family peace. Children learned that polite behaviour did not require perfect affection. You could be angry with the person beside you and still pass the peas carefully. You could believe your sibling had taken too much butter and still ask for it without accusation. Please and thank you provided a narrow bridge over many small disputes, allowing dinner to continue before anyone reopened an argument that had begun in the backyard. Forgetting the words could produce a familiar pause. An adult held the pitcher without pouring. A serving plate remained suspended between two places. The child repeated the request louder but not better, and then heard the question that generations remember: what is the magic word? Please was not actually magic, of course. It did not increase the amount of dessert, improve the flavour of the cooked vegetables, or make the final pork chop larger. But it did unlock the stalled transaction. Once the word appeared, the milk was poured and the meal resumed. Some parents insisted that a child begin the request again from the start. Others accepted a quickly added please attached to the end like a caboose. Repeated correction could feel irritating, particularly when the missing items sat within sight, but the purpose was to make courtesy automatic. Adults wanted the polite phrase to arrive before the reminder, not after it. Households differed in how formal these exchanges became. Some children were expected to say yes, ma'am, or no, sir, while others used first names, family titles, or more relaxed speech. Cultural and regional traditions shaped how respect was expressed, and a warm gesture or attentive action could carry as much meaning as a particular phrase. In busy families, people sometimes passed dishes without ceremony because everyone already knew the routine. Yet even informal tables often had a limit. Demanding food, snapping at another person, or accepting help without acknowledgement could still draw correction. The rule was less about performing polished etiquette than about preventing the meal from becoming a series of commands. Several people were sharing one table, one set of serving dishes, and often one limited amount of food. Politeness made that sharing easier. Please and thank you also softened disappointment. A child could decline a second serving, politely thank an aunt for a dish that would not become a favourite, or accept a smaller portion without turning the moment into an insult. This did not mean children always succeeded. Honest reactions still appeared in facial expressions adults could read from the far end of the table, but the expected words gave children a way to manage those reactions. Courtesy allowed them to participate in the meal without announcing every private judgment. It reminded them that another person's effort deserved consideration, even when the result included creamed vegetables, canned beets, or a casserole whose ingredients were keeping their identities confidential. Once a request had been made and gratitude properly delivered, conversation could continue. Yet even polite words had to wait for the right physical moment. A child eager to tell a story sometimes began while still chewing, producing a sentence that nobody could understand and several adults did not wish to watch. The next rule concerned not what children said, but what had to happen inside the mouth before they were permitted to say it. A child with important news could discover that one bite of meatloaf had suddenly become a complete barrier to communication. The story might concern a playground argument, a spelling test, a missing bicycle, or the remarkable thing the dog had done near the neighbour's porch. The child wanted to tell it immediately before a sibling interrupted or an adult changed the subject. Unfortunately, the mouth was still full. In many 1960s households, the response came at once: finish chewing before you talk. The 10th dinner rule required children to keep their mouths closed while chewing and wait until the food was swallowed before beginning a sentence. This was not merely a demand for silence. It was a lesson in appearance, safety, patience, and consideration for everyone looking across the table. A child might believe the story could not survive another 10 seconds, but adults generally preferred the risk of delayed information to the sight of mashed potatoes participating in the conversation. The rule began with the physical act of chewing. Lips were expected to remain closed, food stayed inside, and bites had to be small enough to manage without visible struggle. A child who loaded a fork with meat, potatoes, and peas in one ambitious construction often created the very problem the rule was designed to prevent. The mouth became too full to chew comfortably. Breathing required planning, and any attempt to speak produced sounds that no family member could translate. Parents therefore corrected both the talking and the size of the bite. Don't take so much at once could arrive before chew with your mouth closed, followed by now swallow before you answer. Dinner turned into a sequence of small instructions designed to make eating appear effortless. It was not effortless, especially for a hungry child who treated the first several bites as a race against circumstances nobody else understood. There were practical reasons for insisting on silence while chewing. Speaking with food in the mouth increased the chance of coughing, choking, spitting crumbs, or sending a small piece of dinner toward another person's plate. Laughter made the risk greater. A child began telling a funny story, a sibling added one detail, and suddenly the table faced a combination of milk laughter and unfinished food that could end badly. Adults wanted children to chew, steadily swallow carefully, and drink without trying to answer a question at the same time. The rule also made conversation easier to understand. Families already competed with the clatter of silverware, a refrigerator motor younger children, and sometimes a radio or television in another room. A sentence delivered through a mouthful of bread added one more obstacle. The speaker might repeat it twice, each version less clear than the first, while everyone else waited for the bite to end. It was faster, safer, and considerably more pleasant to finish chewing before the story began. The difficulty was that adults frequently asked questions during the meal. How was school sounded simple until it arrived just after a forkful of potatoes. Did you finish your homework appeared while the child was chewing roast beef. Who broke the lamp in the basement somehow arrived at the exact moment every child at the table needed additional time. A well-trained diner learned not to answer immediately. The child kept chewing, perhaps raised one finger to signal that a response was coming, swallowed, and then spoke. This pause could be interpreted as good manners or careful legal preparation depending on the question. Younger children often forgot and attempted an answer anyway, prompting the adult to say, "I can wait." That phrase carried two messages. The first was polite, "Finish your food safely." The second was less comforting, the question was not going away. Keeping the mouth closed while chewing also protected other diners from seeing the meal after it had changed form. Adults rarely explained the rule so delicately. They might simply say, "Nobody wants to see that," which was usually accurate. Family tables place people close together under bright kitchen lights, sometimes directly across from one another. A child chewing openly could make an ordinary vegetable suddenly seem less appealing to everyone. This mattered especially when company visited. Parents who tolerated some relaxed behavior during a weekday supper often became more attentive when grandparents, neighbors, a minister, or a family friend sat at the table. Children were reminded beforehand not to chew, noisily smack their lips, or speak with food in their mouths. The ordinary kitchen became a public stage, and every bite appeared to represent the family's entire history of child training. Different foods created different challenges. Peanut butter could hold a sentence hostage for an unreasonable amount of time. Corn on the cob encouraged large bites and left evidence between the teeth. Tough meat required longer chewing than a child had budgeted for the conversation. Spaghetti introduced the temptation to begin talking, while one final strand still connected the mouth to the plate. Soup made noise a separate issue, especially when a child tried to cool it by blowing dramatically or drinking from the spoon with more enthusiasm than restraint. Cracker celery and crisp vegetables produced sounds even when the mouth remained closed. The rule did not require complete silence from the food itself, but children were expected to avoid adding unnecessary effects. Slurping, smacking, and exaggerated chewing could earn correction even without a single spoken word. A family meal was allowed to sound like people eating. It was not supposed to sound like a microphone had been placed inside someone's mouth. Children also used the rule against one another. A brother interrupted a sister's story by announcing that she was talking with food in her mouth. A younger child watched an older sibling closely, hoping to catch the same violation that had been corrected moments earlier. The rule became another instrument in the quiet competition for fairness. If one child had to swallow before speaking, everyone else should too. Adults sometimes appreciated the assistance, but more often reminded the table that correcting siblings was not an assigned dinner chore. Nothing prolonged a meal faster than children enforcing manners on one another with personal enthusiasm. The original offence disappeared beneath an argument about who had spoken first, who had more food in the mouth, and whether pointing out bad manners was itself bad manners. By then the potatoes were cooling, and the family had moved far from the peaceful conversation adults had imagined. Yet the lesson behind the rule remained useful. It taught children that having something to say did not require saying it instantly. They could pause, finish one action, and then give another person their full attention. They learned to listen while chewing and speak when ready, creating a rhythm in which conversation moved around the table without colliding constantly with the food. For some families, dinner was one of the few parts of the day when adults and children exchanged stories in the same room. The rule helped make those stories understandable. It also revealed the limits placed on children's voices because waiting to finish a bite was only the beginning. Even with an empty mouth and a perfectly clear sentence, a child could still be expected to remain silent until the adults had finished speaking. The child had finished chewing, swallowed carefully, and finally reached the point where speaking was allowed. That did not always mean speaking was welcome. At many 1960s dinner tables, children were expected to wait until adults had finished a sentence, a story, or an entire line of conversation before adding their own voices. A parent might be describing the workday, a grandparent might be discussing a bill, a neighbour, the weather, or something heard on the evening news. The child had a question, a correction, or a story that felt far more urgent than any of those subjects. Yet interrupting could bring an immediate reminder. Wait your turn. Don't talk over your father, or simply, the adults are speaking. The 11th dinner rule placed conversation inside the same system of order that governed serving bowls and utensils. Words had to wait their turn. For many children, dinner was a place where they were invited to listen first, answer when addressed, and enter the conversation only when an adult made room. The expectation reflected a strong age hierarchy in many households. Adults were assumed to have earned authority through work responsibility and experience, while children were still learning how to behave. A child who interrupted could be seen as impatient, disrespectful, or poorly trained even when the interruption was harmless. The rule was not followed identically everywhere. Some families welcomed lively discussion and asked children detailed questions about school, Others expected younger family members to remain mostly quiet unless spoken to. In crowded or multi-generational homes, several adult voices could dominate the meal, leaving children to exchange glances while waiting for an opening that never quite appeared. The table taught them to observe timing. A pause after laughter might offer a chance. A direct question created permission. An adult putting down a fork and looking toward the child was nearly an invitation. Speaking required not only a clear mouth but an understanding of the invisible traffic moving through the room. Adult conversation often covered subjects children only partly understood. Work schedules, grocery costs, car repairs, school decisions, church matters, and family news circulated between the mashed potatoes and the bread basket. Children listened without always recognizing the significance. They heard the names of people they barely knew, the price of something that seemed uninteresting, or concern about a problem adults would not fully explain. The evening newspaper might be folded on a nearby chair. A radio or television in another room added fragments of national events to local household discussion. Children learned the emotional temperature of the family by listening. A parent's tired voice could make the table quieter. Good news from work could loosen the rules enough for laughter. A disagreement about money could turn the passing of the peas into a very careful operation. Even when children were not invited to speak, they absorbed how adults described the world beyond the kitchen. The hardest part of the rule was deciding what counted as an acceptable interruption. A spilled glass clearly required immediate notice. A younger sibling choking did not wait for a polite opening. A question about the gravy could usually wait. The discovery that the dog had taken something from the counter existed in a more complicated category. Children learned that urgency was judged afterward often by an adult who did not share their definition of emergency. A child might raise one finger, repeat "excuse me" or lean forward until someone acknowledged the request. In stricter homes, even those efforts could be corrected if the interruption seemed unnecessary. In more relaxed households, parents simply asked the child to hold the thought. The phrase, "wait until I'm finished," tested memory as well as patience. By the time the adult story ended, the child might have forgotten the original point entirely, proving that at least some urgent childhood information could survive without being delivered. Siblings made conversational order more difficult because they competed for limited attention. One child began describing a school event, another corrected the details, and a third introduced a completely unrelated subject before the first had reached the important part. Adults stopped the collision by assigning turns. "Let your sister finish. You'll get a chance, one at a time." These instructions taught listening, but they also created strategy. Older children often told longer stories and occupied more space. Younger ones learned to begin with the most dramatic detail before anyone could redirect the conversation. A child who paused too long risked losing the floor to a sibling with stronger timing. At some tables, everyone spoke freely and noise was part of the family's warmth. At others, overlapping voices were treated as disorder. The same meal could therefore feel welcoming in one home and formal in another, even when both families believed they were teaching respect. The rule carried different expectations for different children. Age, gender, culture, family structure, and individual personality could influence who was encouraged to speak and who was expected to listen. A confident older child might be asked for an opinion, while a younger one received only simple questions. Some girls were praised for being quiet and agreeable, while some boys were permitted more argument, though no pattern was universal. In immigrant and extended families, children sometimes moved between languages or helped explain something to an older relative, giving them an important voice at the table. In families where parents worked different shifts, dinner might be the only time a child could report a school problem or ask for permission to attend an activity. The rule against interruption could still exist, but practical life created exceptions. Real households were rarely as silent or orderly as etiquette advice suggested. Babies cried, telephones rang, adults interrupted one another, and children noticed when the standards applied unevenly. Being quiet did not always mean being excluded. Many adults believed children learned conversation by listening to it. They heard how stories were structured, how disagreements were softened, and how one subject moved into another. They learned that not every thought required immediate delivery. At the same time, the table could become one of the few places where a child's day received serious attention. A parent might finally ask about the test, the teacher, the playground dispute, or the note sent home from school. When that opening came, the child was expected to answer clearly and respectfully, without turning the meal into a performance or dismissing the question with one word. The rule therefore worked in both directions. Children waited for attention, but once they received it, they were expected to use it properly. For some people, the memory of waiting carries warmth, because it recalls listening to parents and grandparents whose voices are now gone. For others, it recalls the frustration of having a story ready and no place to put it. Both memories can be true. The rule created order, but it also reminded children that the family table had a rank, and that adulthood came with greater control over the conversation. Still, words were only one source of danger at dinner. A child could wait patiently, speak at the correct moment, and use perfect manners, then undo everything with a single sentence about the food. The casserole might be dry, the vegetables might be unpopular, and the meat might resist every effort of the knife, but announcing that the meal looked terrible was an offence all its own. The casserole could arrive at the table looking pale around the edges, the green beans could have been cooked past their moment of resistance, and the liver could announce itself before anyone lifted the serving fork. A child might take one look and say exactly what everyone else had politely decided not to say. "I don't like that. It smells funny. Do I have to eat it?" In many 1960s households, complaining about dinner was treated as a separate offence from refusing to eat it. The 12th dinner rule required children to keep their first reaction under control, especially when that reaction insulted the food or the person who had prepared it. A wrinkled nose could earn a warning. A dramatic sigh might be noticed from the other end of the table. The sentence "that looks awful" could turn an ordinary supper into a lesson about gratitude before the child had even tasted one bite. The meal did not have to be a favourite. It did, however, have to be approached without a review delivered in the tone of a disappointed restaurant critic. The practical reason was visible in the kitchen. Dinner represented planning money and labour long before it became a plate in front of a child. Someone had checked what remained in the pantry, stretched the grocery budget, thawed the meat-opened cans, peeled potatoes, mixed a sauce, and watched several cooking times at once. The result might have been simple, but the work behind it was not. A child who dismissed the meal in one sentence could seem to dismiss all of that effort as well. This was especially painful in households where one person prepared dinner every day, and then sat down only after everyone else had been served. The cook already knew whether the roast was dry or the gravy had thickened too much. Public confirmation from a 9-year-old added no useful information. Adults often interpreted complaints not as culinary judgment, but as disrespect. The rule, therefore, protected the person behind the food as much as the food itself. Budget pressure gave the rule even more weight. Many families planned meals around what was affordable, available, or already waiting in the refrigerator. A less popular cut of meat might be chosen because it cost less. Canned vegetables lasted longer than fresh ones and required little preparation. Leftovers returned in sandwiches, hash soup, or casserole because throwing useful food away was not considered reasonable. Children did not always see the arithmetic behind the plate. They saw meatloaf for the second time that week or peas that had lost their brightness. Adults saw the grocery money that had to last until payday. Complaining about dinner could therefore sound like complaining that the family had not spent more. Parents rarely explained the household budget in full, but phrases such as food costs money or you should be thankful there is dinner carried the message. The child was expected to understand that preference did not automatically create another option. The rule did not mean children had no dislikes. Nearly every family knew which child avoided onions, which one distrusted anything creamy, and which one could detect a hidden vegetable with remarkable accuracy. Some parents adjusted recipes, served smaller portions, or allowed certain foods to be left alone. Allergies, illness, religious restrictions, and genuine physical difficulty required different treatment, even if families did not always understand those needs as clearly as they might today. But ordinary dislike was often handled through restraint rather than replacement. A child might be permitted to say, "No thank you," when offered seconds, but not. That was disgusting. The difference mattered. One sentence described a preference. The other insulted the meal and everyone still eating it. Children learned that honesty did not require announcing every thought in its strongest possible form. Facial expressions caused nearly as much trouble as words. A child could remain silent while moving vegetables around the plate, examining a casserole as though evidence might be hidden beneath the crust, or staring at a serving spoon with open suspicion. Adults recognized these performances immediately. Don't make a face became part of the same rule as don't complain. Younger children sometimes covered their noses, pushed the plate away, or asked what the dish contained in a tone suggesting a formal investigation. Older children were more subtle. They ate everything else, first cut the disliked item into smaller pieces, and hoped conversation would carry the family beyond the moment of decision. The plate recorded every strategy. By the end of dinner, the unwanted food remained in the center like a small monument to resistance. Certain meals tested the rule more severely than others. Liver and onions, creamed vegetables, canned beets, stewed tomatoes, fish with visible bones, and casseroles containing several soft textures could divide a table quickly. One child's favorite was another child's punishment. Regional dishes, family recipes, and foods connected to a parent's or grandparent's childhood could carry emotional meaning beyond their flavor. Rejecting such a dish might feel like rejecting family tradition. At holiday meals or in another person's home, the pressure increased. Children were warned before arriving not to criticize what the host served. They might be told to take a small portion, eat what they could, and say thank you. A visit was not the time to announce that a relative's famous salad appeared to contain ingredients that should never have met. Adults expected children to protect the host's feelings, even when the recipe had been protected from criticism for several generations. Gentle humor often surrounded these conflicts, although it rarely felt humorous to the child facing the plate. Parents described unfamiliar dishes in encouraging terms, sometimes with more confidence than evidence. A casserole became something you'll like because it contained one ingredient the child recognized beneath four others. Vegetables were said to taste sweet, which children remembered later as an early lesson in flexible language. A parent might take an enthusiastic bite to demonstrate that the food was perfectly good, while another adult quietly reached for extra salt. The child watched all of this with careful attention. Dinner required not only eating but reading the room. If everyone else was chewing politely, one loud complaint would attract immediate notice. The consequence for insulting the meal could be a reprimand, a smaller audience for future complaints, or the requirement to taste the food before forming an opinion. Some children were told that if they did not like dinner, they could wait until breakfast. Others were permitted bread milk or another simple item, but not a separate cooked meal. The exact response varied greatly, and not every household turned food into a contest of obedience. Yet the broader lesson remained common. The kitchen did not exist to satisfy each person's first choice every evening. Dinner was a family arrangement built from limited time, money, and energy. Children were expected to receive it with enough courtesy to keep the table peaceful. That silence around complaints prepared them for the next rule, which reached beyond words and into the structure of the meal itself. It was not enough to avoid insulting the casserole while waiting for something better. In many homes, nothing better was coming. The family ate one dinner prepared in one kitchen, and children were expected to eat what everyone else was eating rather than place an individual order after the plates arrived. The plate placed before a child was usually not the beginning of a negotiation. Meatloaf, potatoes, peas, and a slice of bread appeared together, and in many 1960s households that combination represented the evening's only available dinner. A child who asked for a hamburger, scrambled eggs, or a peanut butter sandwich instead could receive a reply that made the kitchen's policy perfectly clear. This is not a restaurant. The 13th dinner rule required children to eat the meal prepared for the family, rather than request a separate menu built around individual preferences. The cook had already chosen the food, used the available groceries, and coordinated several dishes. Reopening the entire decision after everyone sat down was rarely welcomed. Children might dislike one item, receive a smaller portion, or eat more bread than usual. But the stove was not expected to begin a second shift simply because the casserole had failed to inspire confidence. The rule grew from the practical limits of family cooking. One dinner already required enough work. Meat had to be thawed, vegetables opened or cleaned, potatoes peeled, pans watched, and serving dishes carried to the table. In homes with several children, preparing a different meal for each person would have multiplied both the labour and the dishes waiting beside the sink. The person cooking often had other responsibilities before and after supper, including paid work, laundry, shopping, childcare, homework, supervision, and cleaning. Even convenience products did not eliminate those demands. A boxed side dish still needed water, milk, butter, heat, and a saucepan. Frozen vegetables still required preparation. A canned soup casserole promised efficiency, but someone had to open the cans, mix the ingredients, bake the dish, and later remove the baked-on edges from the pan. One family meal was manageable. 4 private dinners ordered according to mood would have transformed the kitchen into a small business with no employees and unusually demanding customers. The grocery budget strengthened the rule. Families often planned meals around what had been purchased for the week, what needed to be used before it spoiled, and what could stretch far enough to feed everyone. Ground beef became meatloaf because a single package could be expanded with breadcrumbs, onion, egg, or oats. Leftover roast appeared in hash or sandwiches. A chicken could provide Sunday dinner, Monday soup, and perhaps another lunch if nobody became too generous with the first serving. When a child rejected the planned meal, the request for something else meant opening another package using more bread, cracking more eggs, or consuming an item reserved for tomorrow. Children saw a jar of peanut butter and believed an alternative dinner was waiting. The adult managing the pantry saw school lunches the remaining grocery money and several days still standing between the family and the next shopping trip. Large families made individual orders especially unrealistic. A household with 4 or 5 children could contain nearly every possible food preference at once. One disliked onions, another objected to sauces. A third wanted the meat well done, while an older sibling considered that treatment a personal tragedy. If every objection produced a replacement, no shared meal would remain. Parents therefore established one dinner and expected children to adapt. A disliked vegetable might be served in a very small spoonful. Gravy could sometimes be left off. A child might choose between 2 side dishes already on the table. These were adjustments within the meal, not a second meal prepared from the beginning. The rule asked children to accept that family life involved compromise. Nobody received a perfect plate every night, including the adults who had paid for and prepared it. There were, of course, important exceptions. Babies and toddlers often ate simpler foods. Illness might require toast broth gelatin or something easier to digest. Religious observance, allergies, and medical needs could change what appeared on a person's plate. Families also carried different cultural traditions, and a meal considered ordinary in one home might be unfamiliar in another. Some parents kept a simple alternative available for a child with a strong and consistent aversion. Others allowed bread and milk if the main dish could not be managed. The strictness varied widely, and not every disagreement ended with a child sitting before a cold plate. Yet even flexible households often resisted preparing a second hot dinner on demand. The distinction was between accommodating a genuine need and responding to the sudden discovery that a child would prefer something advertised during a television program. The growth of packaged and frozen foods made the idea of choice more visible without necessarily making it acceptable. Supermarkets offered brighter boxes, compartmented frozen meals, canned pasta, instant potatoes, and products promising quick preparation. Children saw foods that looked personal and convenient, especially when advertising suggested that dinner could arrive in an individual tray. Some households occasionally embraced that flexibility. A busy evening might bring frozen dinners with different entrees, allowing one person to choose turkey while another chose fried chicken or meatloaf. Yet those nights often remained exceptions rather than the daily rule. The ordinary family meal still came from one skillet, one pot, or one casserole dish. Convenience changed what the cook prepared, but it did not immediately turn the kitchen into a place where each child selected a private entree. The phrase "you eat what is served" also carried a lesson about respect. The meal represented a decision made for the household, not an invitation to grade the cook's performance. Children were expected to recognize that another person's effort mattered more than the possibility of a preferred sandwich. This could feel harsh when the dish contained a hated ingredient or an unfamiliar texture. It could also create warm memories of foods children resisted at the time and later associated with home. A casserole disliked at age 10 might become the recipe someone searched for decades afterward, because it recalled the sound of plates being set down, a parent's tired voice, and siblings crowded around the same table. The food itself did not always improve in memory. The meaning around it did. Once children accepted that no separate dinner was coming, the next question was how much of the family meal they should take. Serving bowls contained a limited amount, and everyone at the table needed a fair share. A child who piled a plate high before others were served created a different kind of problem. The kitchen did not take individual orders, and the table did not permit one diner to claim the evening supply before everyone else had received a first helping. The serving spoon could make a child feel briefly powerful. A bowl of mashed potatoes arrived within reach, warm and heavy, and for one moment the size of the first helping seemed entirely negotiable. In many 1960s households it was not. Children were expected to take a modest portion past the dish along and wait until everyone had been served before asking for more. The 14th dinner rule was built around a simple fact that the serving bowls made impossible to ignore dinner was shared, and the amount on the table was not unlimited. A child who claimed 2 large pieces of chicken before a younger sibling had received one could expect immediate correction. The same applied to dinner rolls, pork chops, slices of pie, or the browned corner of a casserole that several people had already noticed. Hunger was accepted. Greed was not. The first trip around the table belonged to everyone. Family-style serving made the rule visible. A platter of meat, a bowl of vegetables, and a basket of bread moved from person to person, each one becoming slightly lighter as it travelled. Children learn to judge a reasonable first portion by looking at both the food and the number of people still waiting. 3 rolls remained and 4 diners had not been served. One did not need advanced mathematics to understand the situation, although appetite could make the calculation surprisingly controversial. An adult might say, "Take one for now," or "Make sure everyone gets some." The instruction often arrived before the child had completed the ambitious movement toward a second piece. In larger families, serving order mattered because the last person could otherwise receive only the smallest pieces, the broken biscuit, or the vegetable spoon containing more liquid than food. Fairness was not an abstract lesson. It sat in the center of the table and diminished one helping at a time. The rule also protected the grocery budget. Meat was often one of the more expensive parts of the meal, and the cook had planned portions with a particular family size in mind. A roast was sliced to produce enough servings. Chicken pieces were counted before they reached the platter. Meatballs, stuffed peppers, or pork chops could be matched almost exactly to the number of people seated. Taking an extra piece too early did not create more food. It simply moved the shortage to someone else's plate. Side dishes offered more flexibility, but even potatoes, bread, canned vegetables, and gravy had limits. The person who prepared dinner usually knew how much remained in the kitchen and whether leftovers were needed for tomorrow's lunch. A child saw one final spoonful of macaroni. The adult saw the next day's lunchbox already becoming less complete. Taking a smaller first helping also reduced waste. Children could overestimate their appetite when the food looked especially good or when they feared a sibling might reach it first. A large portion then cooled on the plate while enthusiasm faded. Adults who disliked waste found this particularly frustrating. The child had taken more than necessary, prevented someone else from having it while it was warm, and now appeared ready to abandon the remains. A modest first serving solved several problems. The child could finish it, decide whether more was truly wanted, and then ask for seconds after everyone else had eaten. This was especially useful with unfamiliar dishes. A small spoonful of creamed vegetables or a narrow slice of casserole was easier to face than a mound selected with careless optimism. The rule did not always make the food more appealing, but it limited the size of the disagreement. Waiting for seconds required patience and attention. A child who finished quickly might begin watching the serving bowls while other family members were still halfway through their first portions. The potatoes remained nearby. One roll rested in the basket. The child's fork slowed as the possibility of more food became the most important subject at the table. Yet asking too soon could sound as though the child had forgotten everyone else. Parents might require the serving dishes to complete one full trip before anyone took a second helping. In some homes, adults offered more food once they saw that each person had enough. In others, the child asked politely and waited for permission. The delay was not meant to discourage healthy hunger. It prevented the fastest eater from controlling the meal simply by finishing first. Dinner was not a race in which the prize was whatever remained in the casserole dish. Children sometimes developed methods for securing a preferred piece without appearing selfish. A child passed the bread basket slowly while studying the rolls, then selected one that seemed safely average, but was actually the softest. Another took a modest helping of vegetables while quietly positioning the serving spoon near a favoured portion for the second round. Siblings watched one another closely and reported suspicious behaviour with great energy. He took 2. She got the biggest one. I didn't get any gravy. Adults then had to settle disputes involving evidence that was rapidly being eaten. The rule against oversized first portions reduced these arguments, but it did not eliminate them. Family meals were small exercises in distribution, and children were excellent observers whenever fairness affected dessert fried chicken or the last buttered roll. Not every meal was served from shared bowls. Some plates were filled in the kitchen, particularly when space was limited, or the cook wanted to control portions from the beginning. In those homes, the same principle appeared through a different routine. Children received an initial serving and were told to wait before requesting more. Holiday dinners could be more generous, while meals near payday might require closer calculation. Farm families, city households, military families, working-class homes and multi-generational kitchens all managed portions according to different needs and customs. Some encouraged children with large appetites to eat freely. Others reserved extra food for a parent returning from a late shift. Fairness did not always mean equal portions. Older children, adults doing physical labor, toddlers, and elderly relatives might need different amounts. The rule meant that nobody should take without noticing who else depended on the same meal. A modest first helping taught children to see the table as a shared resource, rather than a collection of private opportunities. Take enough to begin. Leave enough for others. Ask before taking more. These habits could follow children into school cafeterias, church suppers, picnics, holiday gatherings, and any place where one platter had to serve many people. The lesson was practical, but it also carried a quiet moral idea. Satisfaction should not come at another person's expense. Yet once the food reached a child's plate, fairness gave way to a stricter expectation. The portion might have been small, carefully chosen and politely received, but in many homes it was still expected to disappear. The serving bowl had taught restraint. The clean plate would test endurance. The last 3 peas could become the longest part of dinner. They sat near the edge of the plate, no longer bright, no longer warm, and increasingly important to everyone at the table. A child had eaten the meat, finished the potatoes, used the bread to collect the final streak of gravy, and hoped the remaining vegetables might somehow be overlooked. In many 1960s households they were not. The 15th dinner rule was one of the strictest and most widely remembered. Clean your plate and do not waste food. The exact words varied. Finish what you took. There are children who would be grateful for that. You're not leaving the table until those are gone. The message was unmistakable. Once food reached the plate, the child was expected to eat it. A few cold peas, 1 piece of fat, or a spoonful of casserole could hold the entire evening in place, while the rest of the family moved toward dessert dishes, television, and freedom. The rule often grew from adult memories of scarcity, even when children did not know the history behind it. Many parents and grandparents of the 1960s had lived through the Great Depression, wartime rationing farm, hardship, uncertain employment, or years when grocery money demanded careful planning. Their experiences were not identical, and not every household faced serious deprivation, but food waste could carry emotional weight far beyond the value of 1 spoonful. Adults remembered saving drippings, stretching meat using stale bread, preserving garden produce, and turning leftovers into another meal. A child leaving food behind could therefore appear careless about something the older generation had learned never to take for granted. The lecture might begin with the price of groceries and expand rapidly toward gratitude, hard work, and the suffering of distant children whose exact location was rarely explained. The argument was not always logically useful to a child facing cold lima beans, but it revealed how strongly adults connected an empty plate with good character. The clean plate rule also protected the household budget in immediate practical ways. The food had been purchased for a reason, and prepared in a planned amount. Throwing it away meant losing both money and labor. A slice of meat represented more than the cost at the butcher counter. It had been selected, carried home in a paper bag, stored in the refrigerator, seasoned, cooked, sliced, and served. Vegetables had been opened, heated, and placed in a bowl that would later need washing. Even inexpensive foods added up across several children and 7 dinners a week. Parents watching every grocery dollar could see waste accumulating one unfinished serving at a time. Children naturally did not calculate dinner in monthly totals. They calculated the distance between the remaining peas and the pudding in the refrigerator. The two systems of arithmetic met on the plate, and the adult usually controlled the answer. The rule became most difficult when children had not chosen the portion themselves. An adult might place a generous spoonful of vegetables on each plate before dinner began, then insist that every bite be finished. Younger children had small appetites that changed from day to day. A growth spurt could produce a second helping of nearly everything, while another evening brought little interest in food at all. Some families adjusted portions or allowed children to begin with a taste. Others believed that giving in would encourage fussiness and turn every meal into a negotiation. The clean plate then became a contest of endurance. The child cut food into smaller pieces, mixed it with potatoes, hid it beneath gravy, or chased it around the plate while time slowed. Water glasses were emptied in an effort to help difficult bites travel. Bread became a covering device. None of these strategies escaped adult attention for long. Certain foods seemed designed to test the rule. Peas could roll away from the fork and prolong the task through simple physics. Liver grew colder and firmer, while a child considered the available options. Fat from a pork chop resisted chewing and remained visible no matter where it was moved. Cooked carrots became softer, creamed vegetables became thicker, and fish bones introduced a legitimate reason for caution that could be mistaken for delay. Children sometimes slipped unwanted food to a dog waiting beneath the table, although this required an animal careful timing and confidence that the dog would not reveal the arrangement by staring openly at the plate. Napkins offered temporary concealment but created danger during cleanup. Pockets were desperate and usually regrettable. The safest method was often the least attractive: take a small bite, swallow, and repeat until the plate satisfied the adult inspection. Enforcement differed widely. Some parents required only a reasonable effort. A child might have to taste everything but could leave a food genuinely disliked. Other families insisted that the plate be completely empty before the child could leave. The consequence might be losing dessert remaining at the table after everyone else had gone, or meeting the same plate later when hunger returned. Not every household used severe pressure, and many adults quietly removed food once they believed the lesson had lasted long enough. But for children in stricter homes, the empty kitchen after dinner could feel enormous. The overhead light remained on. Dishes clattered at the sink. Voices and television sounds came from another room, while the child sat with a fork and a portion that seemed to grow colder rather than smaller. The punishment was not dramatic. It was isolation from everything happening beyond the table. Modern understanding of appetite, sensory differences, and children's relationship with food has changed the way many families view forced plate cleaning. Even during the 1960s, however, households did not all follow one method. Some parents served small portions and encouraged seconds. Some trusted children to recognize fullness. Others drew distinctions between refusing a food without tasting it and stopping because the child had eaten enough. Cultural traditions, family size, income, health needs, and individual experience all shaped the rule. It would be misleading to imagine every American child sitting beneath the same kitchen light with the same cold peas. Yet the clean plate memory remains powerful because it joined several household concerns in one physical object. Money, gratitude, obedience, nutrition, waste, and parental authority all became visible on a single plate. For many children, finishing the final bite brought immediate relief. The fork touched the plate with a small sound, and the child announced completion before anyone could question it. An adult inspected the result, perhaps moving one scrap that had been mistaken for decoration. Once the plate passed examination, the evening could continue. But freedom was not always the first reward. Across the kitchen, behind the milk, or beneath a cover on the counter, dessert had been waiting. In many homes, sweets were not simply the next course, they were leverage. Dinner had to be completed, vegetables had to be faced, and only then could pudding, cake, canned fruit, or ice cream enter the story. Dessert often waited in full view, which made the remaining vegetables seem more personal. A glass bowl of pudding sat behind the milk in the refrigerator. A sheet cake rested beneath wax paper on the counter. Canned peaches chilled in syrup and a carton of ice cream waited inside a freezer compartment edged with frost. In many 1960s households, children understood that none of these things belonged to them automatically. The 16th dinner rule was simple and powerful: no dessert until the requirements of dinner had been met. The child had to eat enough of the main meal, finish the vegetables, or satisfy whatever standard the adults had set before sweets appeared. Dessert was not merely another course. It was a reward, a bargaining tool, and sometimes the final piece of authority the kitchen possessed. A spoonful of peas could stand between a child and chocolate pudding with all the seriousness of a locked gate. The arrangement gave parents a practical way to encourage children through unpopular foods. A child who had shown little interest in meatloaf could discover surprising determination once cake was mentioned. Carrots that had remained untouched for 15 minutes suddenly became a short obstacle rather than a permanent condition. Adults use phrases such as "finish your dinner first," "3 more bites," or "no dessert if you don't eat your vegetables." The exact requirement varied. Some children had to clean the entire plate. Others only had to taste everything or make what the parent considered a reasonable effort. The child quickly learned that the number of required bites was not always fixed. 3 bites could become 4 if one was judged too small. A forkful divided into tiny pieces might not count as progress. Negotiation therefore required care. Asking too often could remind the adult that the plate still contained more food than either side had initially noticed. Dessert itself did not appear every night in every home. Family income, regional custom, time, health concerns, and the ordinary contents of the pantry shaped what was served. Some meals ended with fruit applesauce or canned peaches. Others brought gelatin, pudding, cookies, pie cake, or ice cream. In many families, dessert was more common on Sundays, holidays, birthdays, or evenings when leftovers from a weekend gathering remained available. A simple weekday sweet might be a small bowl of pudding made from a packaged mix, a slice of pound cake or fruit cocktail spooned from a can. The portions could be modest, but their importance to children was enormous. Dessert arrived after the serious work of dinner, carried its own plate or bowl, and often changed the mood of the table. Adults relaxed. Children stopped studying the vegetables. Even canned pears could seem ceremonial once they were officially identified as the final course. Using dessert as leverage created a familiar household contradiction. Children were told not to value sweets too highly, yet sweets were presented as the prize for successfully eating everything else. The vegetable became an obligation, while the pudding became the reward for obedience. Parents were usually trying to produce a balanced meal with the tools and ideas available to them, not design a lifelong philosophy of appetite. Still, children understood the system immediately. If dessert depended on dinner, then dinner became the price of admission. Some swallowed difficult bites quickly and reached the reward without complaint. Others stretched the meal through negotiation, requesting smaller portions, additional gravy, or permission to mix the offending vegetable with potatoes. A few calculated that dessert was not worth the struggle and announced they did not want any. Adults sometimes accepted this decision. At other times, the statement was treated as a temporary bluff made by someone who would reconsider when cake reached the table. The rule became especially powerful when other family members had already qualified for dessert. Plates were cleared from one end of the table while a child remained with unfinished food. Bowls of ice cream appeared. Spoons touched glass dishes. Someone commented on the cake, perhaps with unnecessary enthusiasm. The waiting child watched every movement while the final vegetable cooled into a less cooperative form. In stricter households, dessert could be eaten in front of the child as a direct consequence. In others, the family waited or quietly saved a portion in case the requirement was eventually met. The scene was rarely dramatic, but the pressure was effective. The child was not only missing sugar, the child was falling behind the evening. Dessert led toward clearing the table television homework or play. Remaining at the plate meant staying inside the problem while everyone else moved on. Children developed methods for surviving the final bites. Vegetables disappeared beneath mashed potatoes where gravy improved both flavor and camouflage. A piece of bread carried creamed spinach with less direct contact. Milk helped difficult mouthfuls travel, although too much milk created a new problem by filling the stomach before dessert arrived. Some children attempted to swallow without chewing, a strategy adults discouraged for obvious reasons. Others chose the smallest fork available and performed a series of bites so tiny that the meal threatened to continue until bedtime. A parent might finally cut the requirement down to a specific number. 2 more bites, and you may have dessert. That sentence became a contract. Children counted carefully, ensuring that each bite was witnessed. Once the second had been swallowed, the announcement came immediately before the adult could revise the agreement. Not all parents use sweets as a bargaining tool, and many families handled dessert more casually. Some served it to everyone, regardless of what remained on the dinner plate. Others did not keep regular desserts at all. A child might receive fruit toast or nothing further because the meal itself was considered complete. Families also changed their approach as children grew older, or as new ideas about nutrition and appetite entered public discussion. But for those who remember dessert being earned, the rule remains attached to very specific objects. The pudding skin under plastic wrap the scoop of ice cream, bending a metal spoon, the square of cake placed on a smaller plate, or the canned peach half resting in syrup. The sweet was rarely expensive or elaborate. Its power came from being withheld until the adults declared dinner complete. When permission finally arrived, the change was immediate. The dinner plate was removed, the dessert dish took its place, and the child who'd spent 20 minutes resisting 1 spoonful of vegetables somehow found room for an entirely new course. Adults noticed this recovery with predictable skepticism. "I thought you were full," someone might say, as though the separate stomach children claimed to possess for dessert required formal investigation. The child did not need to explain. Dessert had been earned, the contract had been fulfilled, and the evening was moving again. Yet finishing the sweet did not give a child permission to vanish from the table. The chair still belonged in place, the adults might still be eating, and one final sentence was often required before escape became official. "May I be excused?" Finishing the last bite did not automatically release a child from the table. In many 1960s households, the chair remained occupied until permission was granted. A child might place the fork neatly beside the plate, push back slightly, and begin preparing to leave, only to hear the familiar question from an adult. "Where do you think you're going?" The 17th dinner rule required one final act of courtesy before the child could disappear toward homework, television, neighborhood friends, or the unfinished construction project waiting on the bedroom floor. The proper phrase was usually, "May I be excused?" It sounded formal for a Tuesday night meal of hamburger patties and canned corn, but that formality was the point. The child was not leaving a lunch counter or walking away from a private snack. The family meal was still in progress, and departure required acknowledgement of the people who remained. The rule prevented dinner from ending in stages so quickly that the table dissolved before anyone had finished eating. Children often ate faster than adults, especially when conversation interested them less than whatever waited in another room. A child could consume the familiar parts of the meal, swallow dessert with remarkable efficiency, and be ready to leave while a parent was still cutting meat or helping a younger sibling. Without a rule, one chair scraped back, then another, and soon the table was surrounded by half-finished plates and open spaces. Adults who had worked to gather everyone for dinner were not eager to watch the family scatter after 12 minutes. Requiring permission slowed the exit and preserved the meal as a shared period rather than a brief stop for food. Even when permission was given quickly, the question forced the child to notice that other people were still seated, and that leaving affected the rhythm of the room. The request itself had to be made properly. Announcing "I'm done" did not always count. Neither did sliding from the chair while asking the question, as though the answer had already been decided. A child was expected to remain seated, wait for a pause in conversation, and ask clearly. In some homes, "May I be excused, please" was the full approved version. In others, a simple "Can I get down" was enough for younger children. The response might be yes, or it might include one more instruction: take your plate, finish your milk, wait for your sister, or help clear the table first. Children learned that the word "excused" referred to more than physical movement. It meant the adult had recognized the meal as complete for that child, and had released him or her from the remaining social and household obligations. Until that moment, the child's place at the table was still active. Permission was not always immediate. Adults might want the family to remain together until everyone had finished, particularly on Sundays, holidays, or evenings when relatives were visiting. A child who asked too early could be told to wait a few minutes. This created a special form of restlessness. The plate was empty, the napkin had been used, and there was nothing left to do except listen to adults discuss subjects with no visible ending. Feet began to swing. Fingers returned to the silverware. The child studied the clock, the doorway, or the sound of a television program beginning in another room. Asking a second time too soon could delay permission further. Experienced children therefore watched for signals: a parent pushing away a plate, a serving dish being covered, or conversation shifting toward cleanup. Timing the request became another small skill learned through repetition. The rule also protected against the abruptness of simply walking away. Leaving without a word could suggest that the meal, the cook, and the company had ceased to matter once the child was full. Asking permission created a polite closing. In some households, children also thanked the cook or said that dinner was good before leaving. When guests were present, the expectation became more important. A child who vanished from the table without acknowledgement might leave behind an empty chair and an uncomfortable impression. Parents wanted children to understand that social occasions had beginnings and endings. One arrived, properly participated respectfully, and left with permission. These habits were meant to travel beyond the kitchen into restaurants, school banquets, church dinners, and visits with relatives. The ordinary table provided daily practice because manners used only on special occasions rarely appeared when needed. Household circumstances changed how the rule worked. In some large families, younger children were excused early, while adults and older children continued talking. In homes where dinner had to fit around shift work, evening classes, farm chores, or school activities, people came and went more freely. A child with homework or a scheduled program might receive permission as soon as the plate was finished. In other families, everyone stayed until the meal ended, regardless of who had eaten fastest. Cultural traditions, age, and family authority shaped who could grant permission and how formal the request sounded. Some mothers made the decision, Some fathers did. Grandparents, older relatives, or whoever was supervising the meal could hold the same authority. There was no universal arrangement, but the underlying expectation was familiar in many homes. Children did not decide alone when their role in dinner was over. The phrase could also become part of family memory because of how often it was repeated. Children asked it hundreds of times across years of weeknight meals. They said it after roast beef fish sticks, macaroni soup and leftovers. They said it eagerly on evenings when friends were waiting outside, and slowly when leaving meant beginning the dishes. Sometimes the question was answered with yes, but take your plate. Sometimes it brought a reminder to push the chair in. Sometimes a parent looked at the unfinished milk, the napkin on the floor, or the spoon left inside a bowl, and simply waited until the child understood what remained. Permission was not freedom from responsibility. It was often the bridge into the next task. Once excused, the child's departure had to be orderly. The chair was pushed back without scraping too loudly, and then returned beneath the table. A plate might be carried to the counter or sink. The napkin was disposed of or placed with the laundry. The child did not run through the room, leave a trail of crumbs, or immediately turn on the television loud enough to replace conversation with noise. In stricter homes, these details could determine whether permission was granted so easily the next night. Dinner ended through a sequence of actions, not a sudden escape, and even after leaving the table, another rule often followed the child into the living room. Comic books, telephone calls, and television had been kept away during the meal because the family table was expected to hold everyone's attention until the final person was finished. The television could be heard from the next room, bright voices and canned laughter slipping through the doorway while dinner sat under the kitchen light. A comic book rested face down on a chair. The wall telephone might ring just as the gravy arrived, its bell sharp enough to interrupt every conversation at once. In many 1960s households, these distractions were expected to remain separate from the family meal. The 18th dinner rule was that comic books, telephone calls, toys, and television stayed away from the table. Children were not supposed to read while eating, carry a favourite object beside the plate, or turn their chairs toward a program playing across the room. Dinner required attention. The food, the conversation, and the people sharing the table were meant to occupy the same few minutes. A child who tried to hide a comic beneath the table could usually count on two discoveries: the story was difficult to follow in poor light, and adults possessed an extraordinary ability to notice when someone was looking downward for reasons unrelated to peas. Printed distractions were among the easiest to bring into the kitchen. A comic book, school paper, magazine, or cereal box panel asked for only one hand and a small patch of table. Children who had reached an exciting page did not always understand why the story had to stop merely because dinner was ready. Yet reading changed the posture and rhythm of the meal. The child bent toward the page, answered questions without listening, and lifted food almost automatically. Pages collected crumbs, fingerprints, and small drops of sauce. A book propped near a plate occupied space needed for serving dishes, and created another object to rescue when milk spilled. Parents often removed it before the meal began, or ordered it closed and placed somewhere out of reach. Homework could receive more sympathy, especially on a busy evening, but even schoolwork was usually expected to pause while the family ate. The table had several jobs, but adults did not always want it serving as classroom, library, and dining room at the same moment. Toys created different problems. A small car rolled too close to the butter dish. Doll accessories disappeared beneath napkins. Trading cards were spread near a glass until one careless movement turned the collection into a lesson about wet cardboard. Younger children sometimes brought a favourite toy for comfort, while older ones carried whatever had occupied them before the dinner call. The rule required these objects to wait somewhere else. Hands were supposed to manage utensils past bowls and help with the meal rather than operate a miniature vehicle beside the potatoes. Toys also invited siblings into disputes that had nothing to do with dinner. One child touched another's possession, denied doing so, and suddenly the family was discussing ownership while the casserole cooled. Removing the objects did not guarantee peace, but it eliminated several causes of conflict before anyone began eating. The telephone presented a more complicated interruption because it could not simply be ignored in every household. Mounted on a kitchen wall or resting on a small telephone table, it rang with no information about whether the call mattered. There was no screen announcing who wanted attention. Someone had to answer, and dinner could pause while an adult crossed the room, lifted the receiver and said hello. Children were often warned that the family did not take social calls during supper. Friends who telephoned at the wrong hour might be told to call back later, and a child who lingered beside the phone risked a parent pointing toward the cooling plate. The rule taught that the person calling did not automatically outrank everyone already seated. Yet exceptions were common. A relative, employer, doctor, or urgent message could change the evening immediately. Families learned to judge the call by tone length, and the expression of the adult holding the receiver while everyone else tried not to listen. Television competed for attention more powerfully than any comic book or telephone call. By the 1960s, television has become a familiar presence in many American homes, often positioned in the living room where sound carried easily toward the kitchen. Some families turned it off before dinner. Others lowered the volume or closed a door. Children knew exactly which program they were missing and could sometimes estimate the remaining meal by theme music heard from another room. The rule against watching television while eating reflected the belief that dinner should preserve conversation and family attention. A child staring past a parent toward the screen was physically at the table, but mentally elsewhere. Questions had to be repeated. Food cooled unnoticed. The program supplied the conversation, leaving family members to eat beside one another without truly sharing the meal. But the boundary was never complete or universal. Frozen dinners, portable trays, and informal meals made television eating increasingly familiar. On certain nights, a family might carry compartmented aluminum trays into the living room and watch a favorite show together. Children could eat from folding tables while adults balanced plates near the sofa. A major broadcast special event, illness, busy schedule, or simple desire for an easier evening could suspend the normal rule. Some families ate near the television regularly while others treated it as a rare privilege. The important distinction was that television meals often felt different from table meals. They were convenient, individual, and less formal. The family might still be together, but the center of attention had moved from the serving bowls and conversation to the glowing screen. Adults sometimes worried that allowing one distraction would invite all the others. A child permitted to watch television might also stop using a napkin, forget to ask for food to be passed, or leave the tray unfinished when the program ended. A comic book could make the child miss a request. A telephone conversation could pull someone away for half the meal. Keeping distractions outside the dining space simplified the expectations. Sit down, look up, listen, eat, and take part. The rule did not guarantee meaningful conversation. Some dinners remained quiet. Others included arguments, tired adults, restless children, and topics nobody particularly enjoyed. Yet even an ordinary conversation about schoolwork weather or tomorrow's schedule gave the meal a shared focus that a television program could easily replace. For many people, the memory of distraction-free dinners is mixed. Some remember the comfort of hearing family stories without a screen present. Others remember watching the clock and hoping to be excused before a favorite show began. The rule could bring people together, but it could also make the meal feel longer when conversation belonged mostly to adults. What it clearly did was mark dinner as a separate household activity. The comic book closed. The telephone call waited. The television continued without its youngest viewer. Attention returned to the plates and the people around them, and once the meal finally ended, the children were not always free to recover what they had missed. Plates still had to be carried, leftovers covered, and dishes washed or dried. Dinner required attention while it was served, then labour, after the last distraction had been allowed back into the room. The meal did not end when the last fork touched the plate. In many 1960s, households' dinner came with work on both sides of the eating, and children were expected to do their share. Before supper, someone placed plates around the table, counted forks, filled water glasses, carried the bread basket or unfolded napkins. Afterward, those same objects had to travel back toward the kitchen in a much less attractive condition. The 19th dinner rule required children to help set the table, clear the dishes or take part in washing and drying. The exact job depended on age, family custom, and who had already spent the afternoon cooking. A younger child might carry napkins and spoons. An older one might scrape plates, cover leftovers, or stand beside the sink with a dish towel. Dinner was not treated as a service performed by one invisible person, while everyone else arrived, ate, and disappeared. The table had been prepared through labour, and in many homes, children were expected to help restore the kitchen before the evening truly belonged to them again. Setting the table could begin while dinner was still on the stove. A child opened the silverware drawer and counted carefully, sometimes placing the fork on the wrong side, and hoping no one considered the matter important. Plates came from a cupboard, glasses from another shelf, and napkins from a holder near the wall. Salt and pepper were carried together. Bread might be arranged in a basket lined with a cloth, while butter was moved from the refrigerator early enough to soften but not early enough to become a shining puddle. In larger families, this routine had to be done quickly because the kitchen was already crowded. The cook crossed between stove and counter. Hot pans occupied every available surface, and children were expected to stay useful without standing exactly where someone needed to step. Learning to set the table therefore meant learning the geography of the room, where to place objects, when to move, and how to avoid asking where the forks belonged for the 4th time that week. The chore also made children part of the household schedule. Supper had to fit between schoolwork, homework, baths, evening programs, and the preparation required for the next morning. Assigning small jobs distributed the burden, even if the distribution was not always equal. One child set the table while another brought in milk. One cleared plates while a sibling dried dishes. In some families, chores rotated by day. In others, they became fixed identities. One child was always the dishwasher, another always dried, and a third somehow specialized in disappearing at the moment work began. Gender often shaped these assignments, with girls more frequently expected to help in the kitchen in many households, though boys also carried plates, took out trash-cleaned pans, or handled other tasks depending on the family. Age mattered as well. Younger children performed safer jobs, while older ones were trusted with hot dishes, sharp knives, or glassware that could not survive a careless collision with the counter. Clearing the table required more judgment than simply stacking everything into one dangerous tower. Serving dishes came first or last according to the household system. Leftovers had to be saved before plates were scraped. Meat might be wrapped in foil, vegetables spooned into covered containers, and gravy transferred into a smaller bowl for tomorrow. A casserole dish could remain warm enough to require pot holders, even though it looked harmless beneath the kitchen light. Children learned which scraps went into the trash which were saved for pets, and which belonged in a container because an adult had already planned another meal around them. One forgotten serving bowl could sit on the table until the food cooled beyond usefulness. One carelessly tilted plate could send gravy down the front of a clean cabinet. Adults therefore gave instructions in sequence: carry the glasses. First, leave the hot pan alone, scrape carefully. Do not stack knives where someone might reach blindly and stop trying to fit 6 plates into 2 hands. At the sink, the work became wet, warm, and repetitive. Not every household had an automatic dishwasher, and even those that did often washed pans, knives, wooden utensils, or delicate pieces by hand. Dishwater filled the basin with soap bubbles that quickly lost their clean appearance. Plates disappeared beneath the surface, glasses were washed before greasy pans and silverware collected at the bottom, where reaching too quickly could be unwise. The washer scrubbed. The dryer stood beside a towel already becoming damp. Clean dishes moved toward the cupboard in a steady rhythm, while family conversation continued in a looser form than it had at the table. The radio might play. A younger child wandered in to ask whether the work was finished. Someone discovered a fork left beneath a napkin in the dining room. The chore could be tedious, but it also created a quieter part of family life, when a parent and child worked side by side without the formality of dinner manners. Naturally, siblings found ways to make the division of labour controversial. The person washing accused the person drying of moving too slowly. The dryer claimed the washer had left food on a plate. One child insisted that setting the table counted as enough work for the evening, while another pointed out that placing 6 forks had not required heroic sacrifice. A dropped spoon could become evidence of carelessness. A greasy pan could be passed back for further attention, beginning a debate over whether it was truly clean. Adults often settle these disputes with little interest in detailed testimony. The dishes had to be finished, the counters wiped, and the floor checked for crumbs. Complaining rarely removed a chore. It usually extended the time spent discussing it. Household routines varied greatly. Some mothers or grandmothers preferred to clean alone because children slowed the process or failed to meet their standards. Some fathers washed dishes regularly, particularly after another person had cooked. In working households, everyone might help because the evening schedule allowed no alternative. In other homes, domestic workers, older relatives, or a rotating group of family members carried the load. Weekend meals could involve more formal dishes and more clean-up, while a quick supper of sandwiches created very little. The rule was not universal, but where children had assigned tasks, those jobs taught that a meal included unseen labour before and after the food. The clean table did not reset itself. The glasses did not return to the cupboard through gratitude alone. Once the final dish was dried and the counter wiped, the kitchen changed character. Serving bowls vanished. Leftovers stood in the refrigerator beneath foil or wax paper. Chairs were pushed in crumbs brushed away, and the light above the table seemed brighter over the empty surface. The child who had helped could finally return to homework television or play with the small satisfaction of being released from the household machinery. Yet one final dinner lesson still remained, and it often appeared before clean-up even began. On the serving plate sat one biscuit, one chop, or one slice of pie. A hungry child might want it, but taking it silently was not allowed. The last piece had to be offered to everyone else before it became yours. The last piece always seemed larger once it became the last piece. One biscuit remained beneath the folded napkin in the bread basket. One pork chop rested on the platter beside a cooling spoonful of gravy. One square of cake waited under wax paper, its corner holding slightly more frosting than the others. A child might notice it long before the adults did, watching from across the table, while pretending to be interested in the conversation. Yet in many 1960s households, reaching for that final portion without speaking was considered selfish. The 20th dinner rule required one small ceremony before appetite could win, offer the last piece to everyone else. Would anybody like this? Or does anyone want the last roll had to be asked clearly enough for the whole table to hear? Only after the others declined could the child claim it. The food might have been ordinary, but the final piece carried a lesson that reached beyond hunger. Before taking what remained, you had to remember that someone else might want it too. This rule mattered most when portions had been carefully planned. A platter might hold one piece of meat for each person, with only a single extra serving available. Dinner rolls came in a number that did not always divide conveniently among the family. Pie and cake were cut according to the size of the pan, not the appetite of the children waiting nearby. The final serving could therefore become a test of awareness. A child who grabbed it quickly might satisfy hunger while leaving another person disappointed. Offering it first allowed the table to decide openly. Sometimes an adult accepted. Sometimes a younger sibling had been hoping for it but was too shy or too slow to ask. Sometimes everyone declined with great politeness while privately calculating whether the offer would be repeated. The rule slowed down the moment just enough to make the last piece a shared decision, rather than a prize awarded to the fastest hand. Children learned that the offer had to be sincere or at least convincing. Asking while already lifting the biscuit toward the plate did not leave much room for another answer. Neither did mumbling the question toward one corner of the table and immediately declaring that nobody wanted it. An adult could send the food back to the serving dish and require the process to begin again. The child had to look around, wait for responses, and accept the possibility that someone might say yes. This made the rule particularly difficult when the last item was the best one, the crispest piece of fried chicken, the soft center roll, or the slice of pie with the neatest crust. Offering a spoonful of cold peas required little moral strength. Offering the final frosted square demanded character. The adults often followed the same ritual, showing children that consideration was not merely a rule imposed downward. A parent might hold the last biscuit and ask whether anyone wanted it. A grandparent could divide the final piece of cake into two smaller portions rather than choose between grandchildren. Someone might insist that another person take it, beginning a polite exchange in which each diner offered the food back. You have it. No, you take it. I've had enough. The conversation could continue until the biscuit cooled completely, but the point was clear. Generosity mattered more than speed. In families where food had to stretch, offering the last serving also acknowledged the quiet arithmetic behind dinner. Everyone had received something, and anyone taking more should first make certain that nobody had gone without. Siblings naturally found ways to complicate the system. One child offered the last roll while looking directly at the sibling most likely to refuse it. Another waited until a younger child had been excused before asking the remaining adults. Someone claimed to have offered the food earlier, though no witness remembered hearing the question. Disputes could begin over whether the last piece was truly available or had already been promised for a parent's lunch. The cook might intervene by cutting it in half, saving it for tomorrow, or assigning it to the child who had eaten the smallest first helping. These decisions reminded everyone that the serving plate did not exist outside the household plan. What looked like an extra piece might already belong to the next meal. A slice of roast could become a sandwich. A biscuit might accompany breakfast. The last piece was not automatically unwanted merely because it remained at the end of dinner. The rule varied with the food and the family. Some households encouraged growing children to finish whatever remained. Others divided every final serving rather than allow one person to take it. At crowded holiday tables, asking the entire room could become impractical, so food was passed again or offered to the nearest relatives. In homes where plates were filled in the kitchen, the last piece might never reach the table at all. Yet the expectation survived in many forms. Notice the people around you before helping yourself. It was the same principle hidden inside so many earlier rules. Wait until everyone is served. Take a modest first portion. Pass the bowl instead of reaching. Say please and thank you. Remain at the table until properly excused. The final piece gathered those lessons into one small decision. Appetite asked, "Can I have it?" Manners asked, "Does anyone else need it first?" Once everyone declined, the child could take the food with a sense of permission that made it taste slightly better. The biscuit was buttered, the chop moved onto the plate or the pie disappeared in careful bites, while the serving dish stood empty. Soon the plates were cleared, the leftovers covered, and the kitchen returned to its evening hum. Across American homes, the rules had never been identical. Some children remember formal prayers and cloth napkins. Others remember paper plates, hurried suppers, television trays, or meals shaped by work shifts and crowded rooms. Some rules created order and consideration. Others created pressure, especially when children were forced to eat beyond hunger or denied a voice at the table. The past was not one perfect family dinner repeated from coast to coast. It was millions of different tables carrying some familiar expectations. What remained consistent was the amount of ordinary work and meaning gathered around the meal. Someone counted portions, watched the clock, wiped the table, and tried to make limited groceries satisfy several appetites. Children learned where to sit, when to speak, how to ask, and what was expected after the final bite. Some lessons faded as schedules changed, family roles shifted, and meals became more individual. Others survived because they were less about the 1960s than about sharing space with other people. Somewhere in memory, a formica table still waits beneath a warm light. The bread basket holds one final roll. A child reaches toward it, pauses, and asks the question that must come first. And decades later, the family may remember that small moment more clearly than what was served for dinner.